Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I am your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm so happy to be back with you again this week. This is Morning Roll Call. So in these episodes, I sit down with you and it's just you and I getting a chance to talk. It is hard to believe that this is episode 99 of the podcast, and it is the 70th Morning Roll Call. So welcome. We are one away from hitting 100, which when I started this back in early 2019, I find that hard to believe, but I appreciate those of you who have joined us week after week, and to all you new listeners, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Of course, this episode is going to be brought to you by our friends at Campfire Blend Coffee. It's campfireblend.com. If you go to campfireblend.com, you use the code BLUELINE, you'll save 10% off your first order. So be sure to check them out. They're a small business that's been helping us for quite some time now. So go to campfireblend.com and use the code BLUELINE for 10% off. So thank you for joining me. This week, I'm going to do a little bit of reading, but it's because there's been a couple news stories that I kind of want to touch on that specifically deal with law enforcement and what we as law enforcement are dealing with. So I'm first going to go back to a news story that came out in, I believe it was May of 2020. I believe I even spoke about it, but the headline reads that the San Francisco chief bans the thin blue line face mask. And Chief Bill Scott told officers he considered the mask a meaningful expression, quoting, but worried that some may see them as divisive and disrespectful. And in fairness to him, he didn't have necessarily an issue with the blue line itself. He just didn't want them wearing these blue line face masks when they were at law enforcement functions or at things that were for the department. And I don't necessarily have an issue with that. I don't necessarily agree with what he said, but I don't necessarily have an issue with it. Not that it really matters whether I have an issue with it or not. But he says, quote, a meaningful expression to honor fallen officers, end quote, but then went on to say that it has become divisive and disrespectful, and because of that, he did not want them wearing them. So that was May of 2020. I bring that one up because it kind of creates the starting point for what I really want to talk about. January 29th, an article came out. This one is from NBC directly, NBC News. And they said that a police chief bans the thin blue line imagery, saying it has been co-opted by extremists. Chief Christian Roman, I'm quoting here, of the University of Wisconsin-Madison said hateful ideologies run counter to the department's core values. Okay. That makes sense, and I don't disagree with that at all. I would hope that they do, because I would hope your core values don't actually allow for hateful ideologies, if I could. But so the reporter goes on to talk about the banning here, and the thin blue line flag, I'm quoting again, which resembles an American flag that has a blue stripe, is a sign of support for law enforcement, but it has also come to signal opposition to the racial justice movement and a symbol of white supremacy or support for the Blue Lives Matter cause. Now, I'm going to read you another article here in a few minutes that I think somebody did a really good job dealing with this issue and talking about it, and that person is a law enforcement officer, and where they talked about this whole idea of how it's being co-opted, and the fact that that in and of itself is kind of a moot point, right? I mean, people co-opt all sorts of things. That doesn't make that what that means. Just because you're crazy and think something means something doesn't mean you're right. Just my thoughts on the matter. And they go on opposition to the racial justice movement, or which, again, the blue line flag really doesn't have anything to do with it. If depending on what you're talking about there, well, we'll get more into that in a minute. And she goes on to say it's also been co-opted by extremists with hateful ideologies, end quote. So she writes this email. She sends it out to those in the department. One thing she says is, quote, the balance is tipped and we must consider the cost of clinging to a symbol that is undeniably and inextricably linked to actions and beliefs antithetical to their values. And then she states, quote, my intent is not to reject outright the symbol for what we understand it to represent, nor do I believe it to be inherently racist, fascist, as many purport. So, if I could, Chief, respectfully ask then, what's the point? And that's kind of why I started with that first article with Chief Bill Scott. Here's the thing with these slippery slope type arguments. I don't necessarily have an issue that you say, hey, listen, in this environment, I don't want you guys doing that. In fact, the easiest way to solve that is if they are wearing face masks to whatever events, get them ones that actually have the badge on them or have the agency logos. It solves the problem. I get that solves some controversy. But the problem is where does this end, right? It all of a sudden becomes this big slippery slope. So now you're like, well, what does it really matter? She's saying you can't have it at work. So let's say that let's say you listen to this radio station, you listen to this podcast, and you are a fan of On the Blue Line. I hope you are. But if you have the On the Blue Line logo that has the blue line on it, because that's what we represent and that's what we're for, and you have this in your office as a detective at this agency, you can't do that. In fact, she goes on to say, visible public displays of thin blue line imagery to include flags, pins, bracelets, notebooks, coffee mugs, decals. Doesn't specifically mention art, but I'm sure it means that as well because it's kind of an all-inclusive statement. It's not going to be allowed. So my first question to this statement is, I have to respectfully ask, what's the point of it if you are not trying to, if you don't think that's really what the symbol represents and you just think these people are pushing it one way or another. But then she goes on to say, instead, she said, her intent, quoting, is to be reasonably responsive to its detrimental impact on many in our community for whom the visible symbol holds a very different meaning, end quote. So if something doesn't mean something, and if people are using it incorrectly, do you, A, try to change the meaning of the initial object and say, hey, listen, we have to get rid of that? Or do we educate people who clearly misunderstand, don't understand? See, this idea that these viewpoints, rather than one side, if we have to be divisive, side, holding one opinion and the other holding the other opinion, and instead we're going to cancel one or the other, a term I'm using intentionally, instead of canceling one or the other, why don't we try to hear the other side, educate, understand why they believe what they believe, understand why they have an issue with it, but then try to extend across the aisle. See, a lot of what's happening here, this divisiveness, is because of these type of responses to it. So Roman mentioned the flags were waved by extremists at the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. I'm going to leave that quote alone right now. I'll get back to it. And then this article goes on to talk about some of the statements Joe Biden made that I've spoken about previously. And then at the very end of the article, I know this, again, I'm going to quote, I know this is hard. I know this issue is complicated. I also know that a symbol is not what holds us together or makes us a team. Rather, it is our shared commitment to service and to first and foremost doing what's best for our community. So that sentence is actually what threw me kind of into a tailspin. And again, I also know that a symbol is not what holds us together and makes us a team. So not necessarily, I see her point, and not to take it out of context. However, symbols are exactly what hold us together. Why do you think it's such a big deal right now, what's going on with some of these sporting events and some of these overpaid sports stars and their reactions toward the Star-Spangled Banner? Why are they intentionally desecrating our flag? Why are all these attacks on symbology so important? Because for this very reason, symbols do hold us together. It stands for something. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it should give us some sort of pride, something that we believe in, something that it's like, this represents what I stand for. This represents what I believe in. And quite frankly, the thin blue line represents what law enforcement does on a daily basis, and it holds together as kind of a cohesive unit. So there's a great article. It was an op-ed piece that was actually sent out by email with SOFREP, and it came out January 10th. and the writer on it is Matt Hill. Matt Hill was a Marine vet, he's a teacher and a police officer. And I'm just going to point out a couple different things from this article. So he starts out with talking about, recently some of you have seen members of the alleged hate groups fly the flag, referring to the thin blue line flag and referring to it as an anti-Black Lives Matter symbol. And it's not an anti-Black Lives Matter symbol. That's not what it, at least not in its original intent and what it means. In fact, the American flag is an anti-Marxism flag. So again, I'm not drawing any correlations here, but obviously if any group, is ran by self-proclaimed Marxists, then the American flag would be the anti or the antithetical to that. So food for thought. However, I go on. According to the Marshall Project, so he's going to share a little bit of the history of the Blue Line flag. And according to the Marshall Project, a nonprofit publication about criminal justice, the origins of the term thin blue line are seen as far back as 1854, and it is referred partially to a British battle formation. However, the term became mainstream among police officers in New York City in 1922. And he talks about how the Dallas police sergeant, Stephen Bishop, who holds a doctoral degree and studies police stress, use of force, and other officer misconduct, he asserted that the term thin blue line symbolizes respect and understanding for families who have lost an officer in the line of duty. And he goes on to kind of segue from there into what his personal feelings towards this article was. And I'm going to link this all up. Make sure you click on when you're done listening to this podcast, be sure you click on the link in the show notes so that you can read this actual article, because it's very well written. But he actually says, in the movie End of Watch, I'm quoting here, there's a powerful quote that for me succinctly describes the thin blue line. And I want to quote that to you because I agree. This is a very good line from a decent movie that actually really embodies what we're trying to say here. Quote, "I'm the police and I'm here to arrest you. You've broken the law. I did not write the law. I may even disagree with the law, but I will enforce it, and no matter how you plead, cajole, beg, or attempt to stir my sympathies, nothing you do will stop me from placing you in a steel cage with gray bars. If you run away, I will chase you. If you fight me, I will fight back. If you shoot at me, I will shoot back. By law, I am unable to walk away. I am a consequence. I am the unpaid bill. I am fate with a badge and a gun. Behind my badge is a heart like yours. I bleed, I think, I love, and yes, I can be killed. And although I am but one man, I have thousands of brothers and sisters who are the same as me. They will lay down their lives for me, and I them. We stand watch together, a thin blue line protecting the prey from the predators, the good from the bad. We are the police." End quote. So he says, the author of this article, Matt Hill, he said that he had spoken to some other brothers and sisters that he had in law enforcement and asked them, what does the thin blue line mean to you? And some are quoted as saying, the thin blue line sees no race. All it sees is a common bond between brothers and sisters to protect the good from the evil. Another, quote, "There are sheep in the world and there are wolves. The thin blue line stands in the middle as a sheepdog to protect the sheep from the wolves," end quote. And yet another stated, quote, "The thin blue line is a banner flag of ideals this country was built upon. It represents the lives of those charged with domestically protecting American citizens at any cost," end quote. So he then segues into how he sees it, and I agree with him completely. He says, in the thin blue line, I see solidarity. And he likens it to the way specialized military units are set up, such as Army Rangers, Army Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, and so forth, he refers to. And the fact that there becomes like this unspoken brotherhood, this commonality. You share something that each of you understand. And he kind of breaks down what that is. So, again, I'm quoting here. First, if you haven't done it, staying up for 12-hour night shifts on a cold, rainy December night sucks. As in, it's totally awful. And that's if you don't get a ton of calls. If you've never responded to a house where a loved one found a family member deceased, you wouldn't quite understand the feeling. If you've never given CPR to a husband while his wife screams, "Save him," in your ear, you might not get it. If you've ever driven that same wife to the hospital and stood with her when they pronounced her husband dead, it may be foreign to you. If you've never worked a double 12-hour shift because 20 minutes for your shift, someone decided to kill, rape, or otherwise maim someone else, then you don't quite know the feeling. If you've never tried to arrest someone high on PCP who wanted to fight the passing cars, it may be a mystery to you. Or if you've never had a complaint made on you because you weren't friendly to the caller during the call for service for a dead raccoon in the street, even though you had just finished giving CPR to a man who minutes before had been playing tennis but is now dead, and you just weren't really in the mood for this stupid call. I'm not saying it is bad that you don't know how these experiences feel, and I'm certainly not saying I'm better or cooler because I do not know, because I do know. I'm just saying you don't know and you don't understand what it's like. And then he makes this profound statement. However, if you're a part of the thin blue line, I know you already get it. I know you just get it by seeing that line on your shirt or your car. And if you have it displayed as a show of support, then at least you want to understand and appreciate those who do. And he goes on. And he talks about how it doesn't matter where you work, whether you are in the New York Police Department or some small sheriff's department in rural Kentucky. You've had very similar experiences wherever you worked, and that line draws that commonality. It ties us together. And if you've listened to the show for any length of time, you've heard me make those exact statements that he makes and talk about the calls that we've gone to. It's powerful, powerful stuff, and it's something that gets lost in these conversations. The other thing the thin blue line stands for is it stands, and again, I'm quoting, in solidarity with the fallen and their families as members of our family, though they were perhaps an otherwise unknown stranger only days prior. Because we understand the training that they've gone through. We understand the things that our brothers and sisters have gone through because they are unique to this profession. If you're a civilian and have never worked in law enforcement or was never in the military or never had some sort of supporting role within law enforcement, maybe, if you worked for a medical examiner's office, you might get some of it. And your experiences would be different than my experiences. Usually I let you guys play with the bodies a little bit more. I mean, we do a little bit, but not to the same degree that my friends at the medical examiner's office do. But in all seriousness, it's different. And that thin blue line helps us draw commonality. It's why I picked that name for this show. Because the On the Blue Line podcast denotes the fact that we're on that blue line and that it affects every part of our life. But as that quote that I gave you earlier stated, we're also human. We're also people. We also breathe and feel and hurt and love and hate. Sadly, we do. The human race hates. I know you say things like that now, people lose their mind. But it's true. But we can learn to overcome it through love, right? So there's a whole part to that. He goes on to talk about those who have recently misrepresented the thin blue line or used it for hate speech and how he unequivocally stands against that, as do I. And I've already talked previously and will not talk anymore about the events back in January at the Capitol building. And I completely condemn them and the actions that were taken. However, I also condemn some of the other things that have happened in response to them because I try to apply common sense to what I do. And he talks about how the term hate speech is very subjective and how some people see the Christian symbol of the cross as the way to eternal life, but others find it hateful or maybe possibly hypocritical. He talks about the Confederate flag. He uses terms that how some people who just solely did not agree with the outcome of the 2020 election or felt that there may have been some irregularities, how they have been labeled as domestic terrorists, which is absolutely happening. And I think he makes a really good point. And he says, and I'm quoting, the cancel culture we are seeing is not sustainable, not for a city and certainly not for a nation. We have to stop allowing people who are on the fringe of anything to control the narrative for a symbol, logo, word, or gesture. And that gets back to exactly what I was saying earlier about the statement made by Roman when she says that I also know that a symbol is not what holds us together. Well, ma'am, with all due respect, it is what holds us together. And we have to not allow this cancel culture, which is really what this is part of, to keep persisting. It's not sustainable, as he pointed out. We cannot keep going down this road. Today, when I'm recording this, it just came out that actress from the Mandalorian series was canceled. It's just ridiculous. And yet they canceled her and didn't cancel one of the main character, who pretty much has said worse things. Something that was pointed out, I believe, by the Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro's show. So this is not sustainable. We cannot keep canceling everything that we don't like. That's where education comes in. That's where speaking with our neighbors. That's where educating them. So this was his conclusion. Then I'll give you my conclusion. He says, if you are so inclined, thank an officer. Fly a blue line flag as a show of support. Thank an officer for what they do, even if they've written you a ticket or been a bit less friendly during your encounter. Ask them how they're doing. Volunteer at a local department or do a ride-along. It'll help you better understand just a touch of how it feels to be part of the gap between good and evil, to be a part of the thin blue line, then make your judgment. And this is right in line with exactly what I said, I believe it was 2 weeks ago when I was talking about some of this craziness that's going on with the cancel culture and with the direction that we're going as a country. And I talked about the importance of getting local. That's what I mean by getting local. Have these conversations with your neighbor. If you consider yourself a strong conservative, have these conversations with your liberal neighbors. If you consider yourself a strong liberal, have these conversations with your conservative neighbors. We don't have to hate each other. We are Americans, and we have symbols, such as the American flag, that tie us together. These do matter. They matter very much. And what those symbols stand for must be protected. So, from there, let me segue into the last portion of the show. Today is President's Day. Happy President's Day. Did you know that President's Day never actually falls on the birthday of any American president, though there are 4 February birthdays? George Washington, William Henry Harrison, Abraham Lincoln, and Ronald Reagan all had birthdays in February, and yet President's Day never falls on any of them. President's Day is often thought of when it comes to George Washington's birthday, which is on February 22nd. And it is the perennial day of remembrance of his birthday. In fact, the Senate would often read, since time of the Civil War, going on for almost 100 years or plus, that they would read his farewell speech or his farewell address given in 1796 when Washington was leaving office. In that speech, it's billed. Here's an introduction to what was said. By September 17th, 1796, when this address was delivered to his cabinet in Philadelphia, the president, George Washington, had already served 2 terms and did not wish to serve a third. His immense popularity had dwindled dramatically due to his fierce federalism and his opposition to the formation of political parties that were emerging. He may have been onto something here. In addition, he was tired of being lampooned in the political press. He considered this message so important that he had the full text published in newspapers around the country 2 days later, so it would reach a much wider audience. The address warned against foreign involvements, political factions, and sectionalism, and promoted religion, morality, and education. And I would argue that the religion and morality and education must all be together. Because when you start removing one from those 3, you're going to have problems. And sadly, we've removed 2 from those 3. But that's a different conversation for a different day. But in his farewell address, I've read parts of it before. If you go back and listen to the July 4th special from last year, I talked about some of the statements and the need for going back in this country. But I want to bring your attention to the first part of the speech and a statement that he makes, because it's right in line with this conversation that we're having about symbology. For this, quote, "For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, the same manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. End quote. You know, I've talked about it time and time again, and I thought today on President's Day, and in light of reading this Thin Blue Line story that came out, that today was just the day to have this conversation with you, and I appreciate you listening to this whole thing. We are in very divisive times. I've said it over and over, and it is no surprise to you. In fact, we're in a time where people are actually labeling anything they don't like hate speech, which is not the definition of hate speech. And when we talk about the idea of protective speech or protecting speech, the only speech we need to protect is the speech that you don't like. If you say something that I like and I agree with, we're not going to have any difference of opinion. If there's no difference of opinion, then why do we need to protect it? What we need to protect is the speech I don't like. What we need to look into or have discourse about are the things that is where we differ. Why do we differ? And when we look at the United States as a whole, we look at it as a very divided country right now. I find it hard pressed for anyone to say that we are a United States. I mean, we are, and we're not. In this division that we're dealing with, there's only one real solution, right? And that solution lies in ending this insanity of canceling anything and everything we disagree with. Our strength, as George Washington talked about, is the common fight and triumphing together. The fact that we could come together, we had common dangers, common sufferings, common successes. We have to find that commonality. We don't have to agree. In fact, I don't want to agree. This world would be quite boring if everybody thought like I did. If everybody thinks like Wayne, Lord help us. If everyone thinks like you, Lord help us. It's those differences that give us our strength. But rather than canceling whatever it is because it offends me or I don't like it, there are plenty of things that I don't like and offend me, but I would never think of saying we have to get rid of these. Now, if it's unconstitutional, if it's anti-American, then it isn't going to be taken over and taken the place in government or whatever. Like, we're not going to make unconstitutional decisions. However, just because you like one thing and I like something else doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of whatever it is you like because I don't like it. You know, you might like Fords and I might like Chevys. Doesn't mean we're going to cancel anyone who has a Ford just because maybe I end up with a stronger voice. It's no different with anything else. We have to find commonality. In that analogy, we both like cars. Let's start there. And I think that's so true with everything we're dealing with right now. You know, when we talk about things at a national level, and we talk about things with America, there is much more that we as citizens have in common than these extremists on both ends of the spectrum, both right and left. And yet, it's those extremists that seem to be running the narrative right now for all of us on both the right and the left. And first and foremost, we as the citizens of America must stop this madness. But then, on the other topic of which we talked about today, the thin blue line, it's no different. You know, there's people that are choosing narratives, choosing to believe that that symbol means this, that, or the other thing that it doesn't mean. Educate. Have those conversations. Have those hard conversations. Ask them why they believe that. You're probably going to hear something about they heard it on mainstream media or that that's what some news report told them. You could probably start there with providing them with factual information. That wouldn't be very difficult right now because I had started keeping a list of things that were put out on national media that were inaccurate, and I had to stop because it was overwhelming the amount of time that I had, so I decided to go a different direction with things. So you could probably start there with pointing out the inaccuracies of the typical media. But that is where it starts. Coming together as a local group, educating each other, and being, in a word, American. Not canceling each other. Being the melting pot that we are. Being the people that we were, that we are. Being the nation founded in these principles that we are. Be who we are as Americans. And for those in law enforcement, that's a different bond. And same, be true to who you are. Be that line. Be the person who stands between the chaos. Be the person in the peace. Be that person. Be proud of being that person. And educate others and educate those around you. And take action within your community to symbolize, to be that person that they can say, you know what? I'm hearing what this group over here is saying, or what this news story over here is saying, but I know so-and-so. I know Bob. I know Wayne. And those guys, that guy actually says what he believes, and he believes what he says, and he stands by it. And quite frankly, I don't think that's what that means, because I've seen that person in their character and their action that they take. And yeah, no, there's something else going on here, and I stand by Bob. I stand by Wayne. I stand by whomever. So that's what I have for you this week. Happy President's Day to you. I hope you have another great week. I hope you'll join us this Thursday for another Interview Room podcast where I sit down with another great guest. I tell you, we've had some really great ones on there, and we've got some good ones yet to come. So please make sure that you join us every week, Thursday, the Interview Room. Until then, I will see you on the Blue Line. Have a great week.